Hello, everybody. I'm doing this little video on the fly on a Saturday night just to make sure that I can get all of the content in so that you guys have live lectures for the whole semester. So this semester, this video applies to either the memory course, so online or in person if you feel like you need to watch this from the in-person class just to get a double dose of me. I know. And it also applies to the cognitive processes class because there is a huge chunk on working memory in your chapter. So while you might be in the cognitive processes class and this might not exactly follow the way the chapter is structured, it should still cover most of the same information. So regardless, you're going to want to open up the Chapter 3 PowerPoint. And you know you're in the right place if you see my funny little brain on the front with his little dumbbells and his FIU shorts that I made from scratch. So please don't make fun of his shorts. It took me a long time to stitch that FIU into that little digital brain short self. If you're in cognitive processes and you haven't seen me yet, welcome. This is what the video is going to be like. So as we move through the lecture, we're talking about what working memory actually is. So basically whatever you're currently thinking about, which is this lecture, or how beautiful my face is, or wow, her hair is a little bit more purple than I'm used to, or if you're like me, you're wondering what the neighbor upstairs is doing, it sounds like they're carving holes in the wall, so I apologize if you can hear that. But anything that you're currently thinking about is what is in your working memory. It's whatever you're conscious of at the current moment. So there's a little bit of a misunderstanding that the majority of us have until they take some sort of course with memory, where we think of memory systems as either being long-term or short-term. So there are two memory systems, and one is long-term memory, but the other isn't short-term. It's not like what we think of when we think of short-term, meaning I didn't remember what I did today or yesterday or maybe for the past week. That's all composing long-term memory. What we think of as short-term memory is actually called working memory by cognitive psychologists and should be called that by everybody. But it is, like I said, whatever we're thinking about right now, and it's a short-term system. So that's why the confusion between long-term and short-term. So your working memory has a very limited capacity to whatever you're currently focusing on and whatever you're consciously aware of. And it's different than your long-term memory because your shorter-term working memory has very limited space. So you can only think about so many things at one time, whereas your long-term memory has this infinite storage where even though you might not be able to access or recall it as well as you would like to, it's still stored in there somewhere. That's why we still know the lyrics to all of the Spice Girl songs, even though we might not want to. Maybe you do want to. I kind of do want to. But it's why we retain so many of these little things that seem pretty insignificant, but we still remember what they are. So now that we've defined what short-term memory is, not short-term memory, look at that. I made the mistake, working memory. Now that we've defined what working memory is, oh, I actually have somebody watching this. Now I'm all self-conscious. So now that we've defined what working memory is, so think of working memory here, and then we've got long-term, and we have this other thing on the other end of the spectrum called sensory memory. So sensory memory is pre-working memory. It's what goes on before your working memory even registers what it is that you're thinking about. And it's used as kind of a buffer or a filter to help us eliminate the noise that we don't really need in the background. And noise can be anything from literal noise to other things that we could be focusing on in the environment. But it helps us sort out what's important since our working memory does have such a limited capacity. And we have different sensory memory for the different senses. So we have an iconic memory an iconic sensory memory for visual, and we have an echoic memory for auditory. And each one of these holds information for a little bit different of a time, with your echoic memory, your hearing being a little bit longer than the rest of the senses in terms of how long your sensory memory can hold on to it and process it before it makes its way into working memory. So in terms of your capacity, there's been different hypotheses on what this capacity actually is, but the very first guy to really come up on our radar, and there's a lot of different scientist names as we go throughout this course. This guy has a pretty normal, generic white dude name. Maybe it's not a white dude name. Maybe. I don't know. But his name is George Miller. And he's the one that came up with this magical number 7, that on average, every person has this working memory that is an average of 7 items. And what he means by 7 as an average is that some people might go a couple items above that. Some people might not be able to handle that much and have a couple of items below that. So it's 7 plus or 2 other items that you can keep in your working memory, which differs from person to person. And there was one task in specific that Miller and other scientists like Miller would use to figure out how much we can actually retain in our working memory. And that is called the digit span test. So basically, Miller or somebody else who was conducting this experiment like Miller would give you a span of digits or letters or something in some way, shape, or form that was in a list, like you can see in slide number 7. So in slide number 7, they use letters, but you could use just randomized numbers as well. And basically, the list would be presented to you. You'd be given a little bit of time to try and memorize it. And then the list would be taken away. You'd be asked to either verbally or written recall what was on that list. And on average, you should be able to recall 7 plus or minus 2 items from that list, letters in the case of the list from slide 7. So even though our working memory has limited capacity, there are things that we can do to maximize the little bubble of information that we can carry around with us. And one of those is by something called chunking, which is something I'm sure a lot of you have actually heard of before. So with chunking, if you haven't been in my previous lectures, I sit on my legs. So occasionally I might like do this because I have to make sure that my leg doesn't fall off. So just so you know, my legs are gonna fall off. Back to working memory. So with chunking, you basically take 2 or more units of information and you kind of cut them down into something that represents something more than it really is. And if you look at my example on slide 9, when we look at area codes, that is an example of chunking. So when we first get a phone number to memorize, we usually memorize it in these little chunks of information, with the area code being first and the next 3 digits and then the next 4 digits, and we can try to remember those down into little chunks. So it'd be much easier for you to remember all of those area codes of different places in Florida, which makes it easier because you're familiar with it. But it's much easier for you to remember those 5 chunked units of the area codes than if I was to just give you the list as a whole. You might be able to process when I give you the list that they are actually area codes. But if I was to move them all around and put them in a different order, it's just easier if you can find something more meaningful to chunk them down into. So it might be even easier for you to remember more numbers in this case if I was to ask you to give me all of the numbers of the area codes and I was to ask you by city. Because for us living in Florida, it's easier to remember Miami, Broward, Orlando, Tampa, Gainesville, and we could probably add several more cities onto that and be able to come up with these numbers because we've added so much meaning to it. than to just ask for those 15 numbers by themselves. Hope that makes sense. So we use chunking in different ways. I know personally, I use it a lot when trying to remember the little code that I cannot get off of my PantherSoft now, that I decided I didn't want to see that little yellow box pop up anymore and ask me if I wanted to verify basically my existence. So now this little Duo app thing makes me remember this number and then go and type it in every single time I want to access PantherSoft. Every time I want to go look and see if I can let one of you in the class or want to do anything, want to go check on my financial aid, I have to remember these stupid numbers over and over and over again. So usually what I will do is break the longer number down into smaller sequences, easier to remember them. We all do it in terms of phone numbers. We remember them usually in the 3 chunks, but we do it with different things in our lives too. It doesn't only boil down to number or letter sequences. So when looking at the duration of our working memory, so remember, we're all kind of on an average of spectrum of this 7 plus or 2, which we will invalidate in a second, but how much we're able to retain in that working memory depends a lot on how well we rehearse what we're trying to remember in our working memory. So if I sit here and I have the stupid Duo code to get into PantherSoft, which somebody teased me once and said they knew how to get that off of my PantherSoft. If you know, write to me and let me know. It would make my life so much better. But the duration of those little numbers in my memory is going to depend on how much I rehearse them. So if I was to go look at the Duo number, say that it texted me, and I was to look over it once, and then I was to switch directly into the PantherSoft and try to type it in, I'm probably only going to remember part of the number. And I'm going to have to go look back at the number again, get frustrated all over again, and then type in the rest of the number. Otherwise, I might type it in incorrectly. Then I have to do the whole thing all over again. So if I was to spend more time looking in the actual app or the text message it sent me, if I was to spend more time looking at the number and really rehearse it over and over, and there's different ways that you can rehearse, but in this case, you'd probably just be repeating the numbers to yourself over and over. And then I was to go back into the actual PantherSoft and write it in, it's going to be a little bit more accurate if I spend more time looking at the number. Usually I have my phone next to me with the number in it, and I have my PantherSoft up on my computer, and I just frustratingly type it once, realize that I didn't have the little box that you can type it into, select it, and then I have to go type it again, and then I'm done with it. And then it times me out and I have to do it all over again. You didn't know this, but these webinars, they're just secretly a therapy session for me to vent about random things in my life, like the Duo app. I'm sure many of you feel the same way about it. So different ways that you can rehearse information. One, like I said, repeating the same thing over and over to yourself so that you keep it fresh in terms of the sequence and the content in your memory. And that's just called maintenance rehearsal. You can do something called elaborative rehearsal, which is what we would have been doing if we remembered those area codes as cities rather than numbers. So we were associating the items in that digit span list with something that comes from our long-term memory, which would be our knowledge of area codes based on cities. And we had better encoding because it was already in our long-term memory, and we're going to be able to retrieve it better because of retrieval cues. So if you were to pick one over the other and you really wanted to remember something beyond just, I need to type this number into PantherSoft, you would want to use elaborative rehearsal, because having meaning associated with anything related to memory is always going to produce a stronger memory. And by that, I mean stronger encoding, easier to retrieve and recall. It's always going to result in some sort of stronger memory than if you do something on a more rote level where you just repeat it over and over again. So as soon as you stop rehearsing, regardless of what type of rehearsing it is that you're doing, new information is going to come in to your sensory memory. Your sensory memory is going to be flooded with this new information. And eventually, you're not going to be able to retain the same cycle of rehearsal of the stuff that you were initially doing. And this is called interference. So if I was to sit here and focus on the slide over and over again, I'm rehearsing it in some way, shape, or form, and then my neighbors upstairs, they still sound like they've grabbed a bunch of my bowling balls and they're just throwing them at the wall. Eventually, this information is going to interfere with what I am trying to remember, and it's going to replace that in my working memory. So if you retain this working memory for longer than like 15 to 30 seconds, you can pretty much bet that it's already in your long-term memory. So you've processed it, you've decided it's important, and it's moved on into the place in your memory where things go that you should retain, like Spice Girls lyrics. For me, very important to me in the 4th and 5th grade. All the colors of the world. Yeah, I'll sing it if you want to. Next time I do live stuff, I swear to you, I will. So if you've retained it for longer than that little period of time, especially if it's longer than a minute and you can already recall that information, it's started to move into your long-term memory. So if you forget something, say you looked at the number on your Duo app and 15 seconds, 30 seconds later, a minute later, you don't remember any of those numbers, any of that information, it's been replaced by something. It's been interfered with, and it is no longer in your working memory. Now you're stuck, thinking of all of the Spice Girls lyrics that you are now flooding in from the long-term memory into your brains, and now you can't process anything in your working memory anymore. You're welcome. You're welcome. You want another one? You want another one to interfere with whatever you're thinking about? Let's see. The fair be there. It's all there. The fair be there. Right? Or Santa's enchanted forest. See? Very easy for something to interfere with whatever it is that you're trying to think about and get through your working memory. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that to you. Do another one. Arroz rico, sirve mi mami, por favor. I don't know why. Don't even speak Spanish in my long-term memory. So moving on in terms of our actual lecture. Whoa, my computer made an angry noise. It did not like remembering the fair song. So we were on slide number... Oh no, what's going on here? Wait, what it wants. Okay, so we were on slide number 11 or so. So if you see me looking away from the camera and have this little furrowed brow, it's because I'm trying to figure out what's going on with PowerPoint. This PowerPoint is being kind of, whoa, lots of beeping noises. So let's try this. All right, 1 second. Okay, close out PowerPoint. Do I want to save? No, I don't want to save. I don't want to know what you've done to my document. Now we're going to go back over here. We're going to reopen it. And while I do this, you've got that stuck in your head. Or if you want a better one, if you want a more current one, I'm going to do this. I've already got the slide open, but for the sake of this not being a boring lecture, let's do this. Baby shark doo 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 doo, baby shark doo 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 doo, baby shark doo 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 doo, baby shark. Mommy doo 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 doo, mommy shark doo 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 doo, mommy shark doo 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 doo, mommy shark. Daddy shark doo 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 doo, daddy shark doo 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 doo, daddy shark doo 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 doo, daddy shark. Are you done? You excited now? Okay. Got my PowerPoint back working. Now some of you are gonna like make this viral or Snapchat it or something and be like, look at my dumb professor doing the Baby Shark song. So my PowerPoint is still not cooperating. I have to go slide by slide. So your working memory and your long-term memory, if you still have either one of them after the little baby shark thing, they come from different places in your brain, meaning different areas of your brain process different types of memory. So your working memory comes from your prefrontal cortex and something called your central executive, which we'll get to in a second. But we're talking about, again, that really important place in the front of your brain that processes so many aspects of your emotions and feelings and meaning, which makes sense, right? Working memory, we're trying to process for all of this meaning, and it's using your prefrontal cortex. And then your long-term memory is stored and recalled and whatnot by your hippocampus. So again, that's why damage to the hippocampus results in some kind of amnesia usually, some worse than others, but it's because it deals with your long-term memory. So in terms of understanding that working memory and long-term memory come from different places, we use a test called the free recall test. So either you'll read or you will, like someone will read a list to you, or you will be given a list to read, and then you'll be asked to recall as many words as possible. So basically, if I give you a list with a bunch of different words, baby shark, do, mommy shark, do, away from you, assuming it's not something that's that catchy for you to remember. Then I ask you to recall something that's on the list, and you try to recall as many words as possible. And this usually falls within a typical trend or pattern in terms of what you will remember. And it's called the serial position curve. So on the serial position curve, which you can see in slide 14, you'll see that it's kind of the opposite of a bell curve. You know, it does this sort of reverse bell curve type shape. And we have what we see is the primacy and the recency effect. So when you look at this graph, you're looking at the bottom being where the word is on the list, meaning is it the first thing that you read? Is it somewhere in the middle of what you're reading or you're being read to? Or was it at the end of the list? And then on this axis, you're looking at the probability that you're going to recall it when I take the list away and ask you to recall information from the list. So the primacy effect is that you're going to tend to recall things that are on the beginning of the list because you're going to feel that they're more important in some way, shape, or form. You're going to use your resources to remember the first things, and you're not going to remember more of the last things that are read to you. The recency effect is the opposite. The recency effect is that you're going to remember the things that I told you last or that you read last, and your working memory is not going to have been able to process the things at the beginning because it's already focusing on the things at the end of the list. So basically, primacy, things on the beginning of the list, you remember better. Recency, things on the end of the list, you remember better. The poor middle of the list, regardless of what happens, it just doesn't get remembered as frequently as those two areas. So back to the central executive. If you've got the slides open, which I really hope that you do, you'll see that I've given Mr. Baddeley a nickname. I don't know why, but to me, he's Bad Boy Baddeley. Just like the alliteration of it just flows off the tongue. So Baddeley is a British memory psychologist who is the whole reason, or at least what we attribute to be the reason why we no longer say the term short-term memory and we use working memory instead. So he's the person that came up with this idea that we call it working memory because working is what it's doing. It's constantly working to filter through all of the inputs in your surroundings, meaning light, sound, touch, taste, whatever, and it's filtering that stuff out. So it's always working. We should call it what it is. It's working memory. It's tough. Never gets a break. So on top of it being working memory as opposed to short-term memory, he came up with the idea that working memory has several slave systems or subsystems underneath it that comprise a much bigger idea of what working memory is. And if you get the slides open, you can see that Baddeley, to me, looks exactly like the Night King. There's no way that you're going to convince me that Alan Baddeley is not the person in Game of Thrones. Slave systems, slave army, same thing. Gold medal Olympian, never would have known it. Please go look at the slides so that you don't think that I'm crazy. At least not without reason. So slide 19 breaks down in a visual way what Alan Baddeley believed that working memory actually looks like. So you have a central executive, which I'll get to in a second, and then that goes down and controls these lower systems of the visuospatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, and the phonological loop. And then once it goes through all of the subsystems, it's processed and goes into long-term memory. So we'll start with the visuospatial sketchpad. It's kind of a weird word. When you type it into anything, it's going to say that it's an error. But think of it literally as your mind's eye. It is this sketchpad in your brain that operates to bring up imagery, to retrieve imagery of what something looks like, to process imagery of something that you're looking at that's new. And it's this independent system of working memory that just focuses on the visual aspect of things. So if you're trying to do something like process something visually and process sound at the same time, you're talking about two different systems that are doing that. So your visuospatial sketchpad is your mind's eye. It's dealing with that visual aspect. Next is the phonological loop, which, like the visuospatial sketchpad, the phonological loop deals with auditory memory. It deals with anything that's going to relate to sound, like my upstairs neighbors that are still doing crazy things, particularly sounds that are tied into language. So what I'm doing here right now, it is totally engaging your phonological loop, either for the positive or the negative, but it's engaging it. So instead of being your mind's eye, which is your visuospatial sketchpad, it is your mind's inner ear. So you've got the eye, sketchpad, ear, phonological loop. So it intakes the mostly language-based sound, but sound in general, and processes it for meaning. And then if it feels that there is meaning in what is said, it starts moving it downwards, just like that little chart shows, into the long-term memory. So unlike your visuospatial sketchpad, which tends to be pretty consistent and doesn't get interfered with as much, your phonological loop can be impaired if something is going on in the background. So me talking to you right now is great. You can focus on one particular thing. But if I'm talking to you and you're playing music at the same time, you're not going to be able to attend to both of those things with the same amount of attention. Like, you're going to be divided between trying to pay attention to what I'm saying and whatever is in the background, which is why when you're studying or if you're having a conversation, it gets particularly hard if there's something really loud going on in the background, not to mention the fact that you just legitimately can't hear somebody. But you're getting divided attention in your working memory, and you're like, what am I supposed to listen to? Is it supposed to be the sound of my own voice going into this webcam? Is it supposed to be the sound of the bowling balls upstairs? Is it supposed to be the sound of the cats trying to claw their way under my door because crazy cat lady isn't paying attention to them right now? Who knows? But much harder than if there was just one type of sound coming in. So moving on. So we've gone through visuospatial sketchpad. I swear, it gets me every time. I've said it so many times and it gets me every time. We've gone through the sketchpad, we've gone through the loop. So now we have the episodic buffer. So this is the part of your brain that is going to between the different areas in your working memory. So it's where your auditory, your visual, your long-term all come together to decide whether or not something has enough meaning to be processed into long-term memory. So if we're looking at something, does it have meaning to us? Should we remember this image? If we're hearing something, does it have meaning to us? Should we process this sound into some other type of thing for our memory and whatnot? So It's pretty important that it's there. Otherwise, your sketchpad and your loop and your central executive and your long-term memory probably wouldn't speak to each other whatsoever. It's like that one person in the family that when they're there, everybody talks. But then when they miss the family get-together, it gets really awkward and everything's quiet. Nobody wants to talk to each other. And then they all go off to their own rooms or whatever. Never had a family get-together like that? Okay, maybe it was just me. Maybe I'm the person. Maybe I'm the person that when I leave, it just gets awkward. Never thought of that. So, moving on. I'm so sorry. Every time I click next on my PowerPoint, it takes me to the end of the PowerPoint, and then I have to scroll all the way back up, figure out what I'm talking about, and then forget because my working memory is no longer attending to the fact that my PowerPoint is plummeting all the way to the bottom every time I touch it, and I do it all over again. So the central executive, the little monopoly hat of your working memory system. It is so most of those systems we talked about, they're slave systems. Your central executive is the person that is overseeing what all of those subsystems are doing. So it decides how much attention is going to be given to whichever one of those three subsystems. And it does three main things. So it directs attention. So it directs your attention right now either to the computer or to something else, whatever. It dictates basically what you're going to attend to. It divides attention amongst sources of information. So if you're listening to this and you do have crazy neighbors or you do have cats or you're listening to something in the background, decides how much of your attention is going to go to each one of those things. And then it switches switches attention amongst competing sources of information. So if you're listening to me and specifically have something that's also audio going on, decides what thing you're going to focus on at any given moment. So like think of your eyes. If I want to, I can focus directly on the webcam that's sitting on the top of my computer. And in the background, I can see my bookcase. I know my bookcase is there, but it's more fuzzy than the webcam is because I'm focused on it. But I can decide to look past the webcam and see my bookcase. I can still see my webcam. I still know that it's there, but I can't see it in as much detail as I can see the bookcase that's behind it. That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about switching attention or dividing attention and whatnot. So it decides what information is even going to make it into those subsystems. It is the allocator of resources. It's the person in your family that gives out the allowance to all of the peoples in your family and decides what you're going to spend it on too. See? Working memory, focused on something else, back to the bottom of the PowerPoint. Actually, we're on the last slide. Oh, we've made it. We've made it to the very bottom. So quickly, too. Look at that, 33 minutes when I don't have people asking questions, which is not a bad thing. Write to me, ask me questions. I just wanted to make sure that I got this done in case, like, I got Ebola or something between now and next week. So what else Baddeley found was that you can do tasks with different subsystems, and they wouldn't necessarily interfere with one another. So they use concurrent tasks to, I swear, I speak English. Concurrent task tests. I got it. Which are simultaneous tests that you do by having different sources of information in those tests and seeing if somebody basically can see and hear something at the same time. So they found that if you use different subsystems, you can process things at the same time. So when you're watching a movie, you can process the imagery and you can process the sound of the movie at the same time. One doesn't interfere with the other. They kind of unite into this whole experience of watching whatever movie it is you're going to watch. But if I was to give you a movie and I was to give you a different sort of soundtrack of something, you would have to do something called articulatory suppression, which means that you would have to suppress the rehearsal of one of those sources in order to focus on the other source. So if you're watching the movie and listening to the CD of the Spice Girls at the same time, you're going to have to decide, do I really want to pay attention to everything, or do I want to pay attention to the new Avengers movie? No spoilers, I promise, even though you should have definitely seen it by now. So maybe if you have one source that you already know a lot better than the source which you haven't seen yet, being the Avengers movie, you wouldn't need to give as much attention to the source that you already know, because you've already memorized all the lyrics to them. So it's easier for you to pay attention to the movie. But if you were getting two novel stimuli, meaning two sounds or two sights or two whatever that you've never heard before or seen before, and you were trying to process them in your working memory and retain them as new long-term memories, you would have trouble. You would have to suppress one or the other in order to remember. So that is the entirety of the working memory PowerPoint. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm sorry that I didn't do this with all of you here, but I figure it's easier this way to get information to 3 different classes at the same time without necessarily having interfering questions, because things are due differently for all 3 of you. So if you have any questions about this, like I said, let me know. If you want me to come do Spice Girls at your next karaoke get-together, let me know. I'll be happy to do it. Otherwise, I will see you next video.